The scene that we have before us is quite daring. The Lord accepts this unexpected guest's worship and honour, and in so doing sends a message across the future centuries. In the life of the Church, each age, each culture has its own expression of faith and worship. It is hugely different across the planet. Even in this part of the world, if one compares certain things happening in Ireland with certain things in England, there would be a difference. Some months ago, I had to go over very briefly to talk to a Welsh Norbertine friend of mine in London, because we had discussed certain problems with regard to what might be happening in Wales, and we paused for a moment in prayer in a church which has a history, and it's linked in a sense with this gospel. He explained to me that this little chapel was where the then Anglican John Henry Newman came actually with his father just by chance off the street into this open church. And it is the one referred to in his writings when he was unexpectedly surprised by this way of approaching heaven which he'd never encountered before. I believe that the chapel was the chapel given to the Portuguese ambassador, and it was quaint but prayerful, and given its geographic centrality and availability, was much frequented by simple people in London. And therefore he, from the back, could see what he'd never seen before. He was, of course, used to the decorum of the Anglican institution and approach. Very dignified and somewhat formal, especially in the 1800s. Here he found simple people of various cultural backgrounds just spontaneously cracking that mould by the way they behaved in the chapel. Simple people having no inhibitions, going straight up to a statue, putting their arms around it and giving it a big kiss, and on it would go. And he was dumbfounded. So much so that it got him thinking. This back street chapel actually might have a depth that I don't know about, with all my Oxford background. And he referred to the approach as a holy familiarity with heaven. I make a little jump since I'm brought to that point of geographic presence in London. It also hit me a grace when I was there, because I saw in this chapel, which by now is actually a chapel given over to the care of the ordinariate. That's what Benedict XVI set up to take care of Anglicans coming back en bloc into the Catholic Church. And they, by nature, would be very conservative, so things are maintained as they would be in an Anglican setup, which corresponds basically to what would be seen in the chapel before the Second Vatican Council. So everything is pretty well as it was when it was what it was before given over to them. And even the aspect is very much something which hits you as you come in. It suggests, in its simplicity and verticality, just God. So we got in there and we were moved to prayer by the very nature of the place. But then just caught my eye that there was a young lassie quietly at prayer on the right in the lady chapel. I thought, well, that's nice. This chapel is being prayed in by ordinary people, even young people. But then, and this is the bit that actually struck me, this lassie, as we were about to go out, deliberately got out of her place and asked my friend, how can I get hold of the priest of this place? And he said, we'll have to go just down there, the door knocker will be there and the house is there. And obviously she was a bit hesitant, and it came out very quickly that what she was looking for was just confession. So something in me said, even though I actually know how to get back to the aeroplane, give her what she wants. And I said, well, I actually can hear confession if you want, just I have to cover a deadline with regard to the time. But anyway, I won't be. So we went off, and then I heard a confession. But what hit me was this. That was just in miniature an indication of what the Catholic Church is. Two things were going on there. This lady, who was from Latin America somewhere, had enough English to make a confession. She knew exactly what to do. She was formed by the universal church and the faith of the centuries. She didn't know who she was meeting, but she just knew this was home, this was safe, and the whole sacramental system just worked like that. Very similar to what used to happen even actually in, for instance, the war. You might have priests of the other side confessing soldiers and so on. It was just something not human. But there was something else going on there too, which hit me very strongly. Was it just by chance that we happened to walk into that church just at that point in time? Obviously not. There was a providence there which was making things just happen at the right time. Now, what am I saying? Newman also eventually saw that bit. It took a long time because his whole attitude was the brain, and nothing but the brain. He also had a problem with the fact that he couldn't deny his experience of God and of grace. He talks about it, the moment of being ordained to the Anglican priesthood, and how he'd given himself and all he had as a preacher and a pastor. He was actually a good pastor and a good preacher, so he couldn't deny all that. It's just that at one point, somehow, when he saw just like that what the issue was, then he saw what he hadn't been able to see before, and what after that he saw very clearly. The Anglican institution was but human. Whereas the Catholic, which had been trying in some way not to take on board, trying to keep to the Anglican branch system, was actually of a different nature. And despite the fact that it had no structure at the time, these back street churches, it nevertheless is the only one that could have any pretense to call itself the same thing as the early church had called itself, the Catholic Church, Catholike, according to the whole. And so it was that then the brain somehow yielded. And at that point, it's no longer an intellectual game, and this is the difference fundamentally between a Catholic and a Protestant. A Protestant accepts certain teachings and therefore can choose which ones. The Catholic, on the other hand, worships the teacher in a supernatural way, which makes of, as it were, the reason, the supreme sacrifice. It, as it were, says, I accept, but divinely, what I am no longer in command of, or even if I can't understand it, this is a different gift. This is the divine gift of faith, and it is given in a divine way. And the approach is quite different. it also then leads to a certain freedom with regard to accepting in that divine way what comes to us from the organ of the truth, which is the continuity between incarnation and the teaching order of the Church. It's the same God, the same teacher, and that a Protestant cannot have. The seeds of Protestantism is unfortunately self-destructive and leads to its own confusion. Why? It's based on free acceptation and judgment, whereas the Catholic viewpoint is quite different. I accept directly from God, speaking authoritatively. And by the way, that right now is becoming slightly more complex. Why? Because there is confusion in what is being taught. Therefore we must be aware that the faith of the Church is not within the command of individuals, even in certain places. It's greater. And that submission, that supernatural vision, must be practiced by all. What Vincent of Lerins calls quod semper, quod ubique, quod ab omnibus creditum est. What always, what everywhere, what by all was believed. And over that, no one person or group of persons has power. I just conclude. In the readings from the first epistle to Timothy that we have this week, we have one key passage. It's when St. Paul defines the Church himself. And he uses the word church, ecclesia, as the pillar and column, the bulwark of the truth. And by the way, it's what hit Scott Hahn. Some years ago, I went to visit our prior who was in hospital in Siena, and he had beside him, in French, the translation of Scott Hahn's book. I think it's Rome Sweet Home. And he said, read that. So I took it away and read it, and he, when he got better and came back to the community, wanted it read in the community each evening, the whole of it. So we got the Italian translation, and it was read, so I heard it twice. And I remember that one key moment in Scott Hahn's work, when he was trying to argue against Catholicism, was that he saw from Scripture itself that actually you can't get away from it. The Church is part of the very structure given by the Lord himself who founded it. From the beginning, it is the pillar and column of the truth. So he began also to have something of the experience of Newman, this supernatural surrendering of neat reason and saying, now I don't choose and accept this one or that one, I submit totally, and from you, Lord, accept and see the vision of the truth which cannot be otherwise. The truth is not divided. We can't improve upon it, we receive it. And that applies to every single person in the mystical body, without exception.